The letter trembled in Harriet Kinley's hands as the stagecoach rattled over another rut in the road. Dust swirling through the open window like the uncertainty clouding her future. 3 weeks of travel from Boston had given her ample time to memorize every word of Walter Blackburn's proposal, but no amount of reading could quiet the fear that had nested in her chest since the fire. April 1876. The western frontier beckoned with promise for countless souls seeking fortune and fresh beginnings. For 22-year-old Harriet, it represented her last hope. The textile factory fire that had claimed 12 lives had left her with more than just memories of screams and smoke. The right side of her body bore the twisted, rope-like scars from shoulder to wrist, a permanent reminder of that hellish day when she'd pulled 2 younger girls from the inferno before a falling beam had pinned her against the scorching wall. The matchmaker in Boston had been honest enough. "Men out west are desperate for wives, Miss Kinley, but they want whole women, not damaged goods." The words had stung worse than the burned salve. Still, Mrs. Wilcox had taken her photograph carefully posed to hide her scars and included it with several others sent to prospective husbands in frontier towns. Walter Blackburn's letter had arrived 3 weeks later. A cattle rancher near Copper Creek, Colorado, he described himself as 36, established, and in want of a sensible wife to bring order to my home and companionship to my days. His words weren't romantic, but they were kind, and beggars couldn't be choosers. Harriet had sold her few possessions, purchased a modest trousseau, and boarded the train west with her letter of introduction and marriage agreement. The stagecoach crested a hill, and Harriet caught her first glimpse of Copper Creek in the valley below. It wasn't much a main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple rising above the rest, and scattered homesteads dotting the surrounding grasslands. Nervously, she adjusted the high collar of her traveling dress and tugged her right sleeve lower, ensuring no scars would be visible upon first meeting. "Copper Creek, 10 minutes," the driver called down, her stomach churned with equal parts hope and dread. What if Walter Blackburn took one look at her scarred body and sent her back? She had barely enough money for a return ticket, let alone a new start elsewhere. The stagecoach rolled to a stop outside the town's only hotel, a 2-story clapboard building with Copper Creek Hotel painted across its facade in fading letters. Harriet waited until the other passengers had descended before gathering her courage and her single carpetbag. A middle-aged man in a black suit stepped forward as she emerged. "Miss Kinley," she nodded, swallowing hard. "I'm Matthew Perkins, town mayor. Mr. Blackburn asked me to escort you to his home. He's finishing some business, but will meet us there shortly." He offered a polite smile, but his eyes lingered briefly on her gloved right hand. The mayor's wagon carried them beyond the town's edge, following a rutted trail that wound through golden prairie grass toward a modest ranch house nestled against the backdrop of distant mountains. Cattle dotted the hillsides, and a barn and several outbuildings formed a neat cluster around the main house. "Mr. Blackburn's one of our most prosperous ranchers," Mayor Perkins offered. "Been here 15 years, started with nothing but built himself quite an operation." "Has he ever been married before?" Harriet ventured. The mayor cleared his throat. "No, madam, never found the time, I suppose." They pulled up to the ranch house, a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch and newly painted shutters. A Mexican woman emerged from the front door, wiping her hands on her apron. "This is Elena," the mayor introduced. "She helps Mr. Blackburn with the housekeeping." Elena nodded curtly but offered no smile. Her eyes scrutinized Harriet with undisguised assessment. Inside, the house was clean but Spartan. Heavy furniture, practical rather than beautiful, filled the main rooms. No feminine touches softened the masculine atmosphere, no curtains, flowers, or decorative items. Just the necessities of a man living alone. "Elena will show you to your room," Mayor Perkins said. "Mr. Blackburn should be along shortly. I'll take my leave now." He tipped his hat and departed, leaving Harriet with the stone-faced housekeeper. "This way," Alina said, leading her upstairs to a bedroom overlooking the ranch yard. The room was simple but comfortable, with a large bed, washstand, and wardrobe. "Mr. Blackburn had this prepared for you." "Thank you," Harriet said, setting down her carpet bag. "How long have you worked for Mr. Blackburn?" 10 years, Alina replied. "I come 3 times each week." "Clean, cook, wash," she paused, studying Harriet again. "He is good man, works hard, expects same." With that cryptic assessment, she departed, leaving Harriet alone. An hour passed. Harriet unpacked her meager belongings, changed into a fresh dress high-necked with long sleeves despite the warm spring day, and waited nervously. When hoofbeats finally approached, she moved to the window. A tall man dismounted from a chestnut gelding, handing the reins to a ranch hand. Even from a distance, Walter Blackburn cut an imposing figure, broad-shouldered and straight-backed. Harriet's heart hammered against her ribs as she heard boots on the stairs. A brief knock preceded the door opening. Walter Blackburn filled the doorway. He was not handsome in the conventional sense: weathered face, nose that had been broken at least once, deep lines etched around his eyes from squinting into the sun. But his eyes were kind, a deep brown that matched his thick hair, now removed from his hat and slightly damp with sweat. "Miss Kinley," he said, voice deeper than she'd imagined. "Welcome to Colorado. I trust your journey wasn't too arduous." "It was long but manageable, Mr. Blackburn. Thank you for your concern." She kept her right side angled slightly away, a habit formed over the past 2 years. He nodded, clearly uncomfortable with social niceties. "I've had Alina prepare supper. We can discuss arrangements over the meal if that suits, of course." Downstairs, Alina had set the table with a simple but hearty meal of beef stew, cornbread, and coffee. Walter waited until Harriet was seated before taking his own chair at the head of the table. "I suppose we should discuss terms," he said after they'd begun eating. "As I wrote, I need a wife to manage the household. Alina does well enough, but she has her own family and can't be here all the time. The ranch is growing, and I need someone to oversee things here while I'm working the cattle." "I understand," Harriet said softly. "I'm a hard worker, Mr. Blackburn. I managed my father's household after my mother passed, and I worked in a textile mill for 4 years. He nodded approvingly. "Good. I'm not a complicated man, Miss Kinley. I want order in my home, meals on time, and clean clothes. In return, you'll want for nothing material. I've built this ranch from nothing, and while we're not wealthy, we're comfortable." "What about?" Harriet hesitated, unsure how to broach the delicate subject of their marriage. Walter cleared his throat. "I know these arrangements can be awkward at first. I propose a civil ceremony in town tomorrow, followed by a month of adjustment. We'll share this home as husband and wife in name, and if after a month we both feel the arrangement is satisfactory, we can." He reddened slightly. "We can discuss the more intimate aspects of marriage. I won't force anything upon you, Miss Kinley." Relief flooded through her. A month would give her time to reveal her scars gradually, perhaps even win some measure of acceptance before he saw the full extent of her disfigurement. "That seems fair," she agreed. After supper, Walter excused himself to check on a pregnant mare, leaving Harriet to help Alina clean up. The housekeeper remained mostly silent, but as she was leaving for the night, she paused. "He is good man," she repeated her earlier assessment, "but lonely man, be kind to him." The next morning, Harriet dressed in her best gown, a dove gray silk with subtle lace trim at the collar and cuffs, carefully chosen to conceal her scars while still appearing bridal enough. Walter knocked at her door promptly at 9, dressed in a black suit that seemed to constrain his outdoorsman's frame. "You look very nice," he offered stiffly. "Thank you, so do you." The ceremony at Copper Creek's small white church was brief and sparsely attended, just Mayor Perkins and his wife as witnesses, the minister, and Alina sitting stoically in the back pew. Walter's hands were calloused but gentle as he placed a simple gold band on Harriet's finger. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Walter hesitated only briefly before placing a chaste kiss on her cheek. "Mrs. Blackburn," he said, and something in his voice a hint of warmth, perhaps even pride, made Harriet's eyes sting with unexpected tears. The first week of marriage passed in a blur of domestic activity. Harriet threw herself into organizing the household, cleaning neglected corners, taking inventory of supplies, and planning meals. Walter left before dawn each day to work with his cattle and ranch hands, returning at dusk for supper. Their conversations remained polite but limited, revolving around practical matters. She was careful to maintain her privacy, changing behind locked doors and wearing high-necked, long-sleeved dresses despite the increasingly warm days. If Walter noticed her excessive modesty, he said nothing. They slept in separate bedrooms, passing in hallways with awkward nods. On the 8th day, disaster struck. Harriet was in the kitchen preparing bread dough when Alina burst through the door. "Come quick, accident at the corral, Mr. Blackburn is hurt." Heart pounding, Harriet followed Alina outside to where 2 ranch hands were supporting Walter toward the house. Blood soaked his shirt from a deep gash across his left shoulder. "Bull caught him against the fence," one of the men explained. "Doc Jenkins is out at the Peterson place delivering a baby." "Bring him to the kitchen," Harriet ordered, suddenly calm. "Alina, hot water and clean cloths and my sewing kit from upstairs." They laid Walter on the kitchen table. He was conscious but pale, jaw clenched against the pain. Harriet cut away his shirt to reveal a 6-inch gash across his shoulder. "It needs stitching," she said. "I can do it if you'll let me." Walter's eyes found hers. "Do what you must." Alina returned with the requested supplies. Harriet cleaned the wound with whiskey, causing Walter to hiss between clenched teeth. Then, with steady hands, she threaded a needle. "This will hurt," she warned. "Not my first stitches," he grunted. As she worked, drawing the needle through his flesh with precise, even stitches, Walter watched her face. "You've done this before. My father was a physician before he died," she explained, concentrating on her task. "I assisted him often." When she finished, she bandaged the wound and helped him to his feet. "You should rest, no work tomorrow." Walter scowled. "The cattle your men can manage for a day," she insisted. "The wound will tear open if you strain it." To her surprise, he acquiesced without further argument, allowing her to help him upstairs to his bedroom. As she turned to leave, his hand caught her wrist. "Thank you," he said simply. Harriet nodded and slipped away, heart racing at the brief contact. The next morning, she brought breakfast to Walter's room, finding him already dressed but moving stiffly. "The bandage needs changing," she said, setting down the tray. He submitted to her ministrations without complaint, sitting on the edge of the bed while she unwrapped the soiled bandage. As she worked, her sleeve rode up slightly, exposing an inch of scarred flesh on her right wrist. Walter's hand shot out, grasping her arm before she could pull away. Gently but firmly, he pushed the sleeve higher, revealing more of the mottled, puckered skin. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Harriet froze, shame washing over her. "A fire at the mill where I worked." Her voice was barely audible. 2 years ago. Walter released her arm, allowing her to pull the sleeve down. "Is that why you always wear high collars and long sleeves, even in this heat?" She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "The scars, they're extensive, from my shoulder to my wrist, part of my neck and," she swallowed hard, "part of my right breast." A heavy silence filled the room. When she finally looked up, Walter's expression was unreadable. "I should have told you before the wedding," she whispered. "I'll understand if you want to annul the marriage. The matchmaker warned me that men expect whole women, not damaged goods." Walter's jaw tightened. "Matchmaker sounds like a damned fool." He reached for her hand, the touch gentle. "We all have scars, Harriet. Some are just more visible than others." Relief washed through her, but caution quickly followed. "You haven't seen all of them," she warned. "When you're ready to show me, I'll be ready to look," he said simply, then changed the subject. "Now, since you've confined me to the house today, perhaps you could tell me about your life before Colorado. I realize we're strangers who happen to be married." For the first time since her arrival, they truly talked. Walter listened as Harriet shared stories of her childhood in Massachusetts, her father's medical practice, her mother's early death from pneumonia, and her own work at the textile mill. In turn, he spoke of his youth in Pennsylvania, his journey west at 18, the years of backbreaking work to build his ranch from nothing. "Never had time for courting," he admitted, "or perhaps never found a woman worth making the time for." "Until you sent for a mail-order bride," Harriet said with a small smile. Walter's eyes met hers. "I'm not good with words, Harriet, but I'm glad it was you who answered my letter." The confession, simple as it was, warmed her more than she expected. That evening, after Walter had retired to his room, Harriet stood before the small mirror in her bedroom and slowly unbuttoned her high-necked dress. The scars looked worse in the lamplight, angry and red against her pale skin. They covered her right shoulder and stretched down her arm like a twisted map of pain. A smaller patch marred the side of her neck, and another disappeared beneath her chemise, covering the upper curve of her right breast. How could any man find her desirable now? Even Walter's kindness might not extend to accepting this level of disfigurement in a wife. The next morning, Walter insisted on returning to work despite her protests. "Can't lie around when there's cattle to move," he said, though he promised to avoid heavy lifting. As May turned to June, a new rhythm developed in the Blackburn household. Harriet gradually took full control of domestic matters, freeing Alina to spend more time with her own family. She learned to cook Walter's favorite meals, discovered his habit of reading history books in the evenings, and grew accustomed to the way he stomped mud from his boots before entering the house. Small gestures began to bridge the gap between them. Walter started bringing her wildflowers he found while riding the range. Harriet took to leaving cups of coffee on the porch when she heard him approaching after a long day. Their conversations over supper grew longer, more comfortable, yet the physical distance remained. Harriet continued to conceal her scars, and Walter never pressed the matter. Their marriage remained unconsummated as the 1-month mark approached. On a particularly hot afternoon in late June, Harriet was hanging laundry in the yard when she heard a wagon approaching. A well-dressed couple she didn't recognize pulled up to the house. Walter was out with the herd and wouldn't return until evening. "Hello there," the woman called, a plump, 50-ish matron in an expensive dress. "You must be Walter's new wife. I'm Margaret Thornton, and this is my husband, James. We're neighbors. Our ranch borders yours to the south." "Harriet Blackburn," she introduced herself, conscious of her work dress and loose hair. "I'm afraid Walter isn't here at the moment." "Oh, we came to see you, dear," Margaret said, descending from the wagon with her husband's assistance. Word travels fast in these parts. When we heard Walter had finally taken a wife, I told James we simply must come welcome you properly. The Thorntons proved difficult to dissuade, and soon Harriet found herself serving them tea in the parlor, grateful that she'd cleaned it thoroughly the day before. "We've known Walter since he first arrived," James Thornton explained. "Hard-working man, never thought he'd settle down." Margaret nodded. "We were beginning to think he'd be a bachelor forever. Such a pleasant surprise to hear he'd sent for a bride." Her eyes surveyed Harriet with undisguised curiosity. "You're from back east, I understand." "Massachusetts," Harriet confirmed. "And how are you finding married life?" Margaret probed, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Very satisfactory, thank you," Harriet replied stiffly. The conversation continued in this vein, with Margaret asking increasingly personal questions thinly disguised as neighborly interest. When the woman inquired whether Harriet was expecting a blessed event yet, Harriet nearly choked on her tea. Mercifully, the sound of approaching hoofbeats signaled Walter's early return. He entered the house, surprise evident on his face at finding visitors. "Thornton," he nodded to James. "Mrs. Thornton, what brings you by?" "Just paying a social call to meet your bride, Walter," Margaret smiled. "She's been telling us how wonderfully you're getting along, Something in Walter's expression hardened. "That's kind of you, but as you can see, we're busy establishing our household. Perhaps next time you could send word before visiting." The barely veiled dismissal hung in the air. James Thornton cleared his throat. Of course, we should be getting back anyway. Cattle to check on, you know how it is." After seeing the Thorntons out, Walter turned to Harriet. "I apologize for them. Margaret Thornton considers herself the social arbiter of the county. She'll be spreading gossip before they reach their own property." "What kind of gossip?" Harriet asked, suddenly anxious. Walter's expression softened. "Nothing that matters. Are you all right?" "She can be overwhelming. She asked if we were expecting a child yet," Harriet admitted, blushing furiously. Walter's face darkened. "Damned busybody." He ran a hand through his hair. "Harriet, our arrangement, the month is nearly up. We should discuss what happens next." Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "Yes, I suppose we should. I won't press you," he said carefully. "If you wish to continue as we are, I'll respect that, but I want you to know—" He hesitated, clearly struggling for words. "I've grown fond of you, more than fond. If you wanted a true marriage in all aspects, I would welcome it." The moment had come. Harriet took a deep breath. "Before you decide that, you should see what you're getting." With trembling fingers, she began to unbutton the high collar of her dress. "You don't have to," Walter began. "I do," she interrupted. "Please, let me show you." Slowly, she unbuttoned her dress to the middle of her chest, then pushed the right side down to reveal her shoulder and upper arm. The scarred flesh stood out starkly against her pale skin, a landscape of pain etched permanently into her body. Walter's face remained impassive as he looked at the revealed scars. Then, to her shock, he stepped forward and gently, reverently, pressed his lips to the worst of the scarring on her shoulder. "Beautiful," he murmured against her skin. Tears sprang to Harriet's eyes. "Don't mock me." Walter straightened, his gaze intense. "I have never been more serious. You are beautiful, Harriet Blackburn. These scars—" His fingers traced them lightly. "They show your courage, your survival. There's nothing about them that diminishes you." A sob escaped her throat as years of shame began to crumble. Walter gathered her carefully into his arms, mindful of her partially undressed state. "You don't have to hide from me," he whispered against her hair. "Not ever again." That night, for the first time, Harriet entered Walter's bedroom. By lamplight, she allowed him to see all of her scars, fighting against the instinct to cover herself as his gaze traveled over her damaged skin. And when he kissed each mark, whispering "beautiful" against her flesh, she began to believe it might be true. Their lovemaking was gentle, Walter mindful of her inexperience and his own powerful build. Afterward, as she lay in his arms, Harriet felt a peace she'd thought forever lost in the fire. "I never thought anyone could look at me this way again," she confessed. Walter's arms tightened around her. "Then the men of Massachusetts are blind fools, and I'm grateful for it." He kissed her forehead. "Their loss, my gain." Summer brought a rhythm to their life together. Walter taught Harriet to ride, laughing with genuine pleasure at her initial clumsiness and praising her determination. She began accompanying him on shorter rides around the property, learning the boundaries of their land and the basics of cattle ranching. As the days grew hotter, Harriet gradually abandoned her concealing clothes. First came shorter sleeves around the house, then lighter fabrics that revealed the scars on her neck. Walter's appreciative glances gave her confidence, and by August, she no longer hesitated to roll up her sleeves while working or to wear a lower neckline on particularly scorching days. The first time she rode into town with her scars visible, wearing a practical short-sleeved dress appropriate for the summer heat, she felt every stare like a physical touch. Whispers followed them down the main street of Copper Creek. "Ignore them," Walter said quietly, his hand protective at the small of her back. In the general store, she heard a woman's voice clearly. "Damaged goods. Can you imagine? Poor Walter Blackburn getting swindled with that mail-order bride." Before Harriet could react, Walter turned to face the speaker, Mrs. Peterson, wife of a neighboring rancher. "Mrs. Peterson," his voice carried through the suddenly silent store. I'd appreciate it if you'd keep your opinions about my wife to yourself. There's nothing poor about a man whose wife saved 2 children from burning to death, even at great cost to herself. I consider myself the luckiest man in Colorado." He turned back to Harriet, whose eyes had filled with tears. "Are you ready, sweetheart? I believe we have everything we need here." As they left the store, Walter's hand firm around hers, Harriet felt something shift inside her. The shame that had been her constant companion for 2 years began to dissolve in the warmth of Walter's defense. That night, as they lay together in bed, Harriet asked the question that had been troubling her. "What if Mrs. Peterson is right? What if you were swindled? The matchmaker took my photograph carefully, hiding the scars. You didn't know what you were getting." Walter propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with serious eyes. "Do you know what I asked for in my letter to the matchmaker? I said I wanted a sensible, hard-working woman who wouldn't mind the isolation of ranch life. I never mentioned beauty, though you're beautiful to me. I never mentioned unblemished skin or a perfect face." His hand traced the line of scars down her arm. "What I got was a woman with more courage and strength than anyone I've ever known. A woman who manages my household better than I ever could, who can stitch a wound steady as any doctor, who learns to ride even though she's afraid of horses." He kissed her gently. "If that's being swindled, then I hope to be swindled every day for the rest of my life." Harriet pulled him down for a deeper kiss, her heart too full for words. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and the preparations for winter, Harriet began to suspect she was with child. Her monthly courses, always regular, failed to appear, and certain foods that she'd previously enjoyed now turned her stomach. She kept her suspicions to herself for nearly 3 weeks, wanting to be certain before sharing the news with Walter. One morning in late September, as Walter prepared to ride out to check on the herd, Harriet approached him with a small wrapped package. "What's this?" he asked, surprised. "Open it," she urged. Inside the wrapping paper was a tiny knitted bootie. Walter stared at it uncomprehending for a moment, then his eyes widened. "Harriet, are you saying?" She nodded, suddenly nervous. "The baby should arrive in early spring. April, I think." Walter let out a whoop that startled the horses in the corral. In one fluid movement, he lifted Harriet off her feet and spun her around, his face alight with joy. "Put me down, you'll make me dizzy," she laughed, though her heart soared at his reaction. He set her gently on her feet but kept his arms around her. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby." His hand moved to rest protectively over her still flat stomach. "Are you feeling well? Do you need anything? Should you be resting more?" Harriet laughed at the rapid-fire questions. "I'm perfectly fine. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, you know. Not my woman." "Not my baby," he said with a fierceness that made her breath catch. "I want Dr. Jenkins to check on you regularly, and we should hire more help around the house. You shouldn't be lifting heavy things or working too hard." "Walter," she said gently, "I'm pregnant, not invalid." "But," she added, seeing his concerned expression, "I wouldn't object to some help with the heavier chores as things progress." That seemed to satisfy him. "I'll ride into town today and arrange for the doctor to visit, and I'll ask Alina if her niece might be available to help with laundry and such." The news of Harriet's pregnancy spread quickly through Copper Creek. To her surprise, the town's response was overwhelmingly positive. Women who had previously whispered behind their hands now approached her with congratulations and advice. Even Mrs. Peterson made a point of stopping her outside the church to offer a somewhat stiff but seemingly sincere best wishes. "The baby changes everything," Alina explained when Harriet mentioned the shift in attitude. "You are creating new life. This makes you, how you say, valuable to them now." While the explanation bothered Harriet, the idea that her worth was tied to her fertility rather than her character, she couldn't deny that the change in treatment was welcome. For the first time, she began to feel truly accepted in Copper Creek. As her body changed with the pregnancy, Harriet discovered an unexpected benefit. Her focus shifted from her scars to the miracle growing inside her. The rounded curve of her belly seemed to draw all attention, her own included, away from the marks of her past. Walter's attentiveness bordered on obsessive. He insisted on accompanying her to town for every visit with Dr. Jenkins. He enlisted ranch hands to build a cradle and bookshelves for the nursery they were preparing in the small room adjacent to their bedroom. When the first snow fell in November, he refused to let her step foot outside without bundling her in multiple layers, despite her protests that she was overheating. "You're smothering me," she finally said one evening after he tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of mending downstairs. Walter looked stricken. "I just want to take care of you both." Harriet softened, taking his hand and placing it on her now prominent belly where the baby was kicking vigorously. "Feel that. That's our strong, healthy child, and I'm strong too, Walter. You don't need to treat me like I might break." He sighed, resting his forehead against hers. "I never expected to have this," he admitted quietly. "A wife I adore, a child on the way. I'm terrified of losing it all," understanding dawned. Walter, who had built his ranch from nothing through sheer determination, who faced down angry bulls and bitter winters without flinching, was afraid. Not of the challenges he could fight with his hands, but of the fragile happiness they'd created together. "Oh, my love," she whispered, cupping his weathered face between her palms. "I'm not going anywhere, neither is our baby, but you have to let me be your partner, not your porcelain doll," he nodded slowly. "I'll try, no promises about not worrying, though." "I wouldn't expect miracles," she teased, kissing him softly. Winter settled over the Colorado plains, transforming the landscape into a vast white expanse broken only by the dark shapes of ranch buildings and the skeletal forms of leafless trees. The cattle were moved closer to the ranch, sheltered in the lee of hills and fed with hay stored during the summer months. With the outdoor work reduced by weather, Walter spent more time in the house, working on projects for the baby's arrival. He built shelves, repaired loose floorboards, and crafted a rocking chair for Harriet that she declared the most comfortable seat in the house. December brought Christmas, their first as a married couple. Harriet decorated the house with pine boughs and red ribbons, filling the rooms with the scent of evergreen. On Christmas Eve, they exchanged gifts by the light of the fire. Walter gave Harriet a silver locket containing a lock of his hair. "For the baby to have something of me close to their heart," he explained. Harriet's gift to him was a handsome leather-bound ledger for the ranch accounts, with his initials embossed on the cover. "So you can keep better track of your empire," she smiled. As they sat together watching the fire, Harriet felt the baby shift and roll within her. Taking Walter's hand, she placed it where the movement was strongest. "That's a strong kick," he marveled. "Boy or girl, this one's going to be a handful." "Like their father," Harriet teased. Walter's face grew serious. "I hope our child has your courage, Harriet, your strength, and your kindness," she added softly. "Your capacity to see beauty where others see only damage." He kissed her then, with a tenderness that still made her heart race after months of marriage. "Not damage," he murmured against her lips. "Never damage, just marks of a journey. Evidence of survival." January brought a fierce blizzard that isolated the ranch for nearly 2 weeks. The snow piled in drifts higher than the windows, and the temperature dropped so low that water froze in buckets inside the barn. Walter and his 2 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse worked constantly to keep paths clear to the barn and to ensure the cattle had access to feed and unfrozen water. Harriet, now 7 months pregnant and feeling increasingly ungainly, kept the home fires burning literally and figuratively. She baked bread daily, prepared hearty stews and soups, and kept watch at the windows for the men's return from their outdoor labors. On the coldest night of the storm, with the wind howling like a living thing around the eaves of the house, Walter returned from the barn with frost rimming his beard and exhaustion lining his face. "Lost 2 calves," he reported grimly as he shed his ice-encrusted outer clothes. "Would have been more if Jackson hadn't noticed the snow collapsing that lean-to." Harriet guided him to the chair closest to the fire and knelt to remove his boots. "You've done everything humanly possible, Walter. No man could do more." He sighed, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. "A rancher is judged by how well his stock weathers the winter." "Then you'll be judged favorably," she assured him, rising with difficulty due to her expanded midsection. "Now there's hot stew and fresh bread. You need to eat." Later, as they lay together in their bed piled high with quilts against the bitter cold, Walter placed a protective hand over Harriet's rounded belly. "What shall we name this little one?" he asked, his voice drowsy with approaching sleep. Harriet considered. "If it's a boy, perhaps William." "After your father," Walter nodded. "And if it's a girl, Hope," Harriet said without hesitation, "because that's what she represents to me, a new beginning, hope for the future." William or Hope Blackburn, Walter tested the names, strong names for a strong child. As February gave way to March, the worst of winter loosened its grip on the land. Snow began to melt, revealing patches of muddy earth beneath. The creek that gave the town its name broke free of ice, rushing noisily with snowmelt from the distant mountains. Harriet's time grew closer. Her body felt stretched to its limits, her back ached constantly, and sleep became elusive as the baby seemed determined to practice somersaults in the middle of the night. Yet she had never felt more beautiful. Walter's admiring gaze followed her everywhere, and his hands constantly sought contact with her rounded form. Dr. Jenkins visited weekly now, pronouncing both mother and child healthy, but warning that first babies often arrived later than expected. "Don't be surprised if you're still waiting when April arrives," he cautioned. Walter had arranged for Alina to stay at the ranch full-time during the final weeks, sleeping in the small room off the kitchen. Her presence was a comfort to Harriet, who appreciated both the help with household tasks and the older woman's experience with childbirth. "My 5 children, all born healthy," Alina told her while they prepared dinner one evening. "You will do well, your body is strong." On the last day of March, Harriet woke before dawn with a dull ache in her lower back. By mid-morning, the pain had wrapped around to her abdomen, coming in waves that gradually increased in intensity. When her waters broke as she stood at the kitchen sink, Alina immediately sent one of the ranch hands for Dr. Jenkins. "The baby comes," she told Walter, who had rushed in from the barn at the commotion. "You go boil water and bring clean linens, many clean linens." Walter looked torn between following orders and staying with Harriet, who was breathing heavily through another contraction. "Go," Harriet managed to say between breaths. "I'm fine. Alina knows what to do." The next 12 hours passed in a blur of pain, exhaustion, and determination. Dr. Jenkins arrived by mid-afternoon, his calm presence reassuring as the labor intensified. Walter refused to leave, despite the doctor's initial suggestion that husbands traditionally waited elsewhere. "My place is with my wife," he said firmly, positioning himself behind Harriet to support her back as she labored. As dusk fell, Harriet's strength began to flag. The contractions came relentlessly, but the baby seemed no closer to arriving. "You must push harder," Dr. Jenkins urged. "The baby is in position, but you need to help it along." Harriet, drenched in sweat and trembling with exhaustion, shook her head weakly. "I can't, I have nothing left." Walter leaned close, his voice low and intense in her ear. "Yes, you do. You survived a fire that would have killed most people. You traveled across the country alone to marry a stranger. You faced down the gossips in town without flinching." His hand found hers, squeezing tightly. "You are the strongest person I know, Harriet Blackburn. Our child needs that strength now." Drawing on reserves she didn't know she possessed, Harriet bore down with the next contraction, a primal cry tearing from her throat. And suddenly, amazingly, she felt the baby move. "The head is crowning," Dr. Jenkins announced. "One more good push, Mrs. Blackburn." With Walter's support and Alina's encouragement, Harriet gave one final, monumental effort. The sensation of the baby sliding from her body was both excruciating and exhilarating. A moment of silence, then a lusty wail filled the room. "A girl," Dr. Jenkins announced, placing the squalling, red-faced infant on Harriet's chest. "A healthy girl." Harriet gazed down at her daughter through a veil of tears. Tiny fists waved in protest at the cold world, and a shock of dark hair Walter's hair covered the perfectly formed head. "Hope," she whispered, running a gentle finger along the baby's cheek. "Our hope." Walter's arms encircled them both, his face wet with unashamed tears. "She's perfect," he managed, voice choked with emotion. "Just like her mother." As Dr. Jenkins tended to the aftermath of the birth and Alina cleaned and swaddled the newborn, Harriet leaned back against her husband's solid chest, exhausted but filled with a joy so profound it transcended the physical pain. "Thank you," Walter murmured against her hair. "For what?" "For answering my letter, for taking a chance on a stranger, for giving me a family." His arms tightened around her, "for showing me what real beauty is." Harriet turned her face to his, their lips meeting in a tender kiss. "Thank you for seeing past my scars to the woman beneath." Alina approached with the now bundled infant. "Your daughter, Mr. and Mrs. Blackburn." She placed Hope in Harriet's arms with a rare, warm smile. "She is beautiful." Looking down at Hope's perfect face, Harriet felt the final pieces of her heart healing. The scars on her body would always remain, but the wounds to her spirit had closed, replaced by something stronger and more resilient. Like the land around them, which bore the marks of harsh winters yet burst into spectacular life each spring, she had endured and flourished. "Yes," she agreed, meeting Walter's adoring gaze over their daughter's head. "She is beautiful, and so loved." Spring blossomed across the Colorado plains, painting the ranch lands with wildflowers and fresh green grass. Hope Blackburn thrived, growing stronger each day, her dark eyes so like Walter's, taking in the world with solemn curiosity. Harriet discovered the fierce, all-consuming love of motherhood. She spent hours simply watching Hope sleep, marveling at the perfect fingers and toes, the bow-shaped mouth that was unmistakably her own. Walter proved to be a devoted father, cradling his daughter with hands that could break a wild horse yet were infinitely gentle with the tiny infant. On a warm day in late May, as Hope approached 2 months of age, Walter suggested a picnic by the creek that ran through the eastern edge of their property. He hitched the wagon, lined a wooden crate with blankets to create a safe nest for Hope, and packed the lunch that Harriet had prepared. The spot he chose was shaded by cottonwood trees, with the creek bubbling merrily nearby and wildflowers dotting the grassy bank. After spreading a blanket, Walter helped Harriet settle with Hope while he unpacked their meal. "It's beautiful here," Harriet said, breathing in the scent of grass and clean water. "I can't believe I've never seen this part of the ranch before." Walter sat beside her, stretching his long legs out before him. "There's a lot of the property you haven't explored yet. Maybe when Hope is a bit older, we can take longer rides together." Harriet smiled down at their daughter, who was awake and contentedly watching the leaves move in the breeze above her. "I'd like that, though I suspect this young lady will keep us busy enough that exploring may have to wait." They ate their simple meal: fried chicken, cornbread, and apple pie while taking turns holding Hope. Afterward, Walter grew uncharacteristically quiet, staring at the flowing water with a pensive expression. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Harriet asked, leaning against his shoulder. Walter turned to face her fully. "I've been thinking about how much my life has changed in the past year, how empty the house was before you came, how I never knew what I was missing until I had you and Hope." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "I have something for you. I ordered it from Denver months ago, but with the winter storms, it only arrived last week." Curious, Harriet opened the box to find a delicate gold locket, more elaborate than the silver one he'd given her at Christmas. When she opened it, she gasped. Inside was a miniature portrait of Walter, exquisitely painted on ivory. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "But how? When did you sit for this?" Walter looked slightly embarrassed. "I didn't. I sent a photograph to a painter in Denver who specializes in these miniatures." I wanted you to have something of me to keep close, just as I have this. He touched the simple wedding band on his finger. And I thought, maybe someday we could have a miniature of hope made for the other side. Tears welled in Harriet's eyes as she fastened the locket around her neck. I love it, and I love you, Walter Blackburn. I love you, Harriet Blackburn, he replied, drawing her into his arms for a tender kiss. Scars and all, always. Hope chose that moment to demand attention with a hungry cry. Laughing, Harriet adjusted her dress to nurse the baby while Walter watched with unconcealed adoration. You know, he said thoughtfully, I was thinking we might expand the house next year, add a proper nursery and maybe another bedroom or two. Harriet looked up from Hope's nursing face. Another bedroom or two? Are you planning on more children already? Walter grinned, the expression transforming his normally serious face. Well, Hope should have siblings, don't you think? A sister or brother to play with. The thought warmed Harriet's heart. A real family, something she'd thought forever beyond her reach after the fire. Yes, she agreed softly. I think she should. As the afternoon sun filtered through the cottonwood leaves, dappling the blanket with patches of golden light, Harriet looked at her small family and marveled at the journey that had brought her here. From the horror of the fire to the humiliation of being returned by her first prospective husband. From the long journey west to the discovery of true love with a man who saw beauty where others saw only damage. Walter caught her gaze and smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of his eyes in the way she'd come to cherish. Without words, he reached out to trace the line of scars visible at the edge of her summer dress, his touch reverent rather than pitying. In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the Colorado spring with her daughter in her arms and her husband by her side, Harriet Kinley Blackburn finally saw herself through Walter's eyes not as damaged goods, but as a woman whose scars told a story of courage, survival, and ultimately, of love reborn from the ashes of tragedy. And she was beautiful.